All right, almost there. The period following the collapse of the APG in Melbourne and the closure of the Nimrod in Sydney has, overall, been one of industrial instability and sporadic, usually disastrous government intervention. It is best characterised as a period of short-lived creative projects, with some few notable exceptions, and producing venues with no permanent company of artists working out of them. Functionally, this period of the government funding era operates not unlike the actor-manager era, with an additional pool of funds available from government to support the work of selected companies. In the 40 years since the Pram closed its doors, there have been close to 400 new theatre companies and projects, independent, government-funded, commercial and pro-am, launched in Melbourne alone. To cover even the most recognised and influential of those companies in any detail would take a whole new series. So what I'm going to do here is sketch out those 40 years in broad terms in an attempt to show how the government funding era has shaped the performing arts in Australia since the reorganisation of the Australian Council for the Arts into the Australia Council in 1972. Prior to this, the Australian Elizabethan Theatre Trust had been established by the government of Prime Minister Robert Menzies after lobbying by various influential people led by Dr. H.C. Nugget Coombs, Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia at the time. Menzies had agreed to the support of the non-governmental fundraising organisation, which had been established in 1954, and the donations raised by the Trust would be matched by the government and put towards the development and advancement of Australian theatre. In its first few years, this advancement was conducted through producing and presenting shows at the Trust's own theatre in Sydney. But this was quickly abandoned in favour of supporting external projects such as the production and tour of The Summer of the 17th Doll, and the Trust was also a seeding and founding body for NIDA, the Theatre of the Deaf, the Marionette Theatre of Australia, the Australian Ballet and the Australian Opera. That wasn't enough for Coombs though, and the agitation and lobbying continued until the governments of Harold Holt and John Gorton established the new Australian Council for the Arts. It sat for the first time in November 1968 with Coombs as its first chair and the long-suffering Jean Battersby as its first chief executive officer. 4 years later, with the election of the new Labor government of Gough Whitlam in 1972, the Australian Council for the Arts was renamed simply the Australia Council and relaunched in its now familiar form of several art form-specific boards, 7 at the time, but that changes over the years, who would distribute funding allocated for the arts in the federal budget. Not long after this, in Melbourne, a group of theatre makers and administrators began meeting to discuss the state of theatre in Australia. Among this group, actor and APG founder Graham Blundell, theatre critic Gary Hutchison and MTC administrator Carrillo Gantner were determined to launch a third major mainstream theatre company to fall somewhere between the perceived conservatism of the newly rebranded Melbourne Theatre Company and the radical-ish alternative and legendarily uncomfortable seats at the Pram Factory. These three formed a new company called the Hoopla Theatre Foundation and staged their first 2 plays, remounts of Dorothy Hewitt's The Golden Oldies and Alma de Groen's Chidley, at the Grant Street Theatre on Sturt Street toward the end of 1976. Meanwhile, and there's going to be a lot of meanwhiles because we're covering 40 years here, French director Jean-Pierre Mignon arrived in Melbourne with the Spanish touring company La Claca. He remained and worked briefly with the APG before heading to Sydney to direct Tim Gooding's The Astounding Optimismos. On his return to Melbourne, Mignon and actor Bruce Keller launched the Australian Nouveau Theatre, with productions of The Door and Arto and Cruelty at La Mama in 1981. See, there's La Mama in there again, driving the development of some of the most important theatre of Australia. Arto and Cruelty was a double bill of Antonin Artaud's To Have Done with the Judgment of God and Richard Murfitt's Quick Death to Infinity, and also included a young Julie Forsyth in the cast, who would become a regular company member. Within the year, the company had established themselves in a former church hall in South Melbourne, which they renamed the Anthill. Here they produced innovative modernist stagings of classics by Molière and Chekhov, alongside new works, especially those by French playwright Raymond Queue, including almost regular remounts of his monodramas A Strategy for Two Hams and Kid Stuff. By this time, Hoopla have moved into the old Playbox Theatre on Exhibition Street in Melbourne and taken the new theatre's name. As Playbox, they produced broadly popular works with a mix of local and international new works and classics, including Sam Shepard and Eugene O'Neill, and local writers such as Barry Dickens and Hannie Rayson. At this point in the early 1980s, with the Pram Factory closed, the balance between the 2 major mainstream companies in Melbourne looked set to be maintained, with Playbox taking the place of the alternative to the MTC. However, in 1984, after fire broke out in the old Playbox Theatre and destroyed the building, that balance became less certain. As Playbox became an itinerant company, moving productions between venues such as St Martin's, the Universal and the National Theatre, their grip on a consistent return audience and a settled place in the cultural landscape looked more tenuous. This uncertainty, I would argue, contributed to the rise of Anthill as a strong competition to Playbox during the 1980s. Anthill still had its own, if limited, venue, whereas Playbox's programming policy perhaps had a broader appeal than the more strictly modernist Anthill. That is a hard sentence to say.
You wrote it.
That's why. Playbox also had its own internal administrative difficulties during the 1980s, with unclear lines of authority in the artistic leadership after the departure of founding artistic director Carrillo Gantner. Nevertheless, by the close of the decade, these issues had been largely resolved with the donation of the former CUB Malthouse site to be converted into a permanent theatre for Playbox. Gantner returned to oversee the conversion of the old brewery into a theatre complex, and with its completion and launch in 1990, Gantner announced a new programming policy for the company. During the 90s, Playbox was committed to all new, all Australian work all the time, and in 1994, former late-period Nimrod director and ex-artistic director of QTC, Aubrey Mellor, was announced as the company's new artistic director. Mignon's Anthill had emerged out of the roiling community of makers now commonly referred to as the independent theatre sector, but also variously referred to historically as alternative and or fringe theatre. Professional to semi-professional companies that produce a number of works for local audiences working out of suburban venues such as La Mama, The Church and the Universal. Companies during the 80s that worked in this way included Flash Rat, Whistling in the Theatre. The Church and Anthill were a little more unique in the landscape in that they were both venues with resident companies. Mignon's Australian Nouveau Theatre and John and Lois Ellis's Australian Contemporary Theatre Company, but they were also open for use by other smaller independent companies. Running alongside this artist-driven sector during the 1980s, intersecting with the professional performing arts and local participation, was the professional community theatre movement. We hear community theatre now and we tend to think of amateur suburban theatre companies doing Alan Ayckbourn and quaffing sherry in the foyer. But in the 70s and 80s, professional artists were working with people in their local communities to make new professional theatre. In 1978, Deakin University in Geelong transformed the old woolen mill building into a performance space that would house a permanent company of performance makers. Led by director James McCackey, that company would live in the local community, get to know the local people, learn their history and produce new performances as the Mill Community Theatre. Meanwhile, at the newly opened VCA School of Drama, founding Dean Peter Royston was teaching the new students an approach to theatre making he'd brought over from England, influenced by the work of Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop. This approach was creator-centric, driven by the artists, and made in response to and alongside contributing members of the community. Workshops, storytelling, community engagement were the tools taught alongside acting techniques, and the students were encouraged not to simply wait by the phone for their agent to call, but to go out and create their own opportunities for work in the community. Graduating students from Oyston's first 3 years went on in cohorts to form West Community Theatre, the Murray River Performing Group, who would eventually give us the Flying Fruit Fly Circus, that's a hard one to say as well, and TheatreWorks. However, in 1987, the global stock market crashed on October 19th, wiping 508 points off the Dow Jones Index and sending governments around the world into panic and recession. Around this time, there was a corresponding shift in the relationship between Australian artists and the Australia Council. Along with a marked increase in paperwork and burdensome administration suddenly required from artists in order to access AUSCO funding, 1987 also saw the beginning of a wave of funding cuts that would result in the closure of almost all of the major independent theatre companies and the complete collapse of the community theatre sector. This wave of cuts would continue until 1994, when Anthill would be the final casualty. These same few years were also responsible for the emergence of the major arts and entertainment festivals in Melbourne, namely the Comedy Festival, the Fringe Festival and the Melbourne International Arts Festival, originally named the Spoleto International Arts Festival. All three of these festivals emerge around the same time in the mid to late 1980s and continue to this day. This is also perhaps the last great era of variety in the Tivoli circuit style. The commercial live entertainment circuit that produced Mo McCackey in the 40s was still, in spirit, represented by the cabaret and theatre restaurant circuit in the 1970s and 1980s. Venues such as Les Joke at the Last Laugh and the Flying Trapeze Cafe gave space to acts such as Los Trios Ring Barcus, the Castanet Club, and the comedians who would move into television shows such as Australia, You're Standing in It, The Comedy Company and Fast Forward. This circuit seems to have transformed during the 90s, crystallising around the Comedy Festival, likely due to changing audience tastes and spiralling running costs for the venues during the recession. The 1990s was shaped by the damage caused in the wake of the late 80s funding cuts. In the absence of their resident companies, several of the venues closed, including the Anthill and the Church, leaving the theatre community missing a series of key, mid-sized venues that had provided professional stepping stones between small spaces like La Mama and much larger rooms such as those at Playbox and the Victorian Arts Centre. At the beginning of the 90s, several small artist-driven itinerant companies formed in the spaces left behind by these bigger independent companies, and these companies were collaborations between individuals making boutique works for limited but dedicated audiences, and included $5 Theatre Company, Kick House, Chameleon, Gilgal, Wax Studios and the Keen Taylor Project. With funding restricted and sporadic for these companies, few survived more than 5 years. But I believe they were the first of the companies we now think of as independent. Short-lived collaborations searching out and surviving in niches of community and shared aesthetic interest. By contrast, companies like Ranters, Ilbidgery and Back to Back managed to span the decade navigating the destructive tendencies of the funding process and building important relationships directly with their own dedicated audiences. Raimondo and Adriano Cortese's Ranters Theatre premiered with Lucrezia and Cesare at the old Anthill space and the Large Breast or the Upside Down Bell at La Mama in the early 1990s, and developed interstate and international audiences through touring and festival works. Ilbidgery developed contemporary First Nations theatre, including the landmark work Stolen by Jane Harrison, and Back to Back have developed works like Small Metal Objects and Ganesh versus the Third Reich that have toured extensively to widespread international acclaim. The commercial sector, formerly occupied by J.C. Williamson's, had been thoroughly demoralised and defunct for decades. The majestic old theatres built by Coppin and Melton Black stood unused and in disrepair. In the 1990s, a concerted effort by the Liberal government of Jeff Kennett and the privately owned Mariner Group renovated the Regent, the Princess, the Forum and the Comedy Theatres, and the city attracted productions of Andrew Lloyd Webber's Les Miserables, Phantom of the Opera, Miss Saigon and others. The season of Phantom broke box office records, selling over 1.5 million tickets, running at the Princess Theatre from 1990 to 1993. The success of the Melbourne run of Phantom was widely credited at the time with reinvigorating the commercial theatre, though subsequent decades seem to have settled into large-scale, long-running musical theatre buy-ins with a focus on attracting tourism more than developing new work. Since the 1980s, the Melbourne Theatre Company, still under its founding artistic director John Sumner, had been presenting work out of the Victorian Arts Centre and had long since confirmed its position as the state flagship theatre company. In the 1990s, in its new building, Playbox Theatre settled into its role as the alternative flagship company and produced or premiered some of the cornerstone Australian works of the era. However, this commitment to an all-Australian season eventually resulted in hurried developments and under-rehearsed works being programmed and a corresponding decline in reputation for the company. It was also during this time that the foundations for the major performing arts board of the Australia Council were being laid, and a strategic shift away from cultural and community development and also new media arts was taking place. The new millennium really begins with the opening of a new venue called the Storeroom above an old pub in North Fitzroy. Following the example already set by the Theatre Hydra Network and the Old Fitz Theatre in Sydney, the Storeroom in Melbourne offered a small, affordable and accessible black box theatre to emerging independent theatre makers. Founded by actors Todd McDonald and Ben Harkin, the Storeroom provided space for the early works of companies such as Stuck Pig Squealing, Theatre at Risk, Theatre in Decay, The 11th Hour, The Other Tongue and The Black Lung, and later in the decade these companies were joined by Sisters Grimm. This presaged a rash of similar-styled venues opening, including 45 Downstairs and the Black Box at the Victorian Arts Centre, as well as the establishment of the venue-based company Red Stitch Actors Theatre. These new companies and venues brought renewed energy to a theatre network exhausted by struggling through the 90s. The 2000s were characterised by small, innovative companies making theatre in non-traditional or converted spaces. It saw a rise in politically engaged work in the early part of the decade and a turn towards contemporisation of classics by the end of the decade. The 2000s was also the beginning of what was seen as generational change at the major flagship companies. Sumner had passed the artistic directorship of MTC on to Roger Hodgman in 1988, and Hodgman in his turn handed it on to Simon Phillips in 2000. Phillips' policy of programming popular works and recognisable actors from TV and film contributed to returning the company to financial stability, and he set his and the company's sights on moving out of the Victorian Arts Centre and into their own permanent, purpose-built venue. During the 2000s, the Victorian Arts Centre was increasingly becoming more involved in developing pathways for independent theatre makers to their stage. The Full Tilt program, the Black Box Theatre, and their brief partnership with the short and sweet 10-minute play festival introduced a wide range of new artists and audiences to the Victorian Arts Centre spaces. At the Playbox, however, things were not so settled. Under increasing pressure from critical receptions to their work, Aubrey Mellor stepped down as artistic director in 2004, and the board commenced the search for his replacement. In 2005, Michael Cantor took over the role and shifted the company away from its policy of programming exclusively Australian playwriting, and also rebranded the company as the Malthouse. Their work once again broadened into a mix of modern interpretations of classics, new local and international works alongside dance and more experimental theatre, and presenting work in partnership with some of the emerging and established independent artists and companies of the era, including Stuck Big Squealing, Black Lung, the Hayloft Project, the Melbourne Town Players, and My Darling Patricia. This new relationship with the indie companies was facilitated by the opening of a third theatre space in the Malthouse building, the small Black Box Tower Theatre, which began by hosting return seasons of successful indie productions that had been produced elsewhere, and then began developing new works in partnership with those companies. The close relationship between the Malthouse in Melbourne and the former Nimrod Theatre, now Company B at Belvoir Street in Sydney, which began all the way back in 1977 with a tour of the elocution of Benjamin Franklin, also facilitated the transference of successful tours between Melbourne and Sydney, allowing these companies access to an emerging national network for smaller itinerant independent companies to build interstate audiences. The 2000s was also characterised by the emergence of an online culture of critical response to live theatre and the beginnings of the collapse of criticism in traditional print media. That online discussion was hosted across a plethora of blogs, of which the first, most influential and best was Theatre Notes, founded and run by poet and critic Alison Croggan. This online culture of debate focused on responding to reviews in detail and sometimes resulted in hundreds of pages of heated discussion. This activity largely lost its momentum towards the end of the decade, as the work was unfunded and considerably time-consuming. Theatre Notes itself ceased to publish in 2012. Incredibly to me, we find ourselves at the time of recording almost at the end of another decade of Australian theatre as we prepare to enter 2019. This decade has been characterised by the consolidation of the two major companies in their own venues, practically next door to each other in Southbank, and another sudden massive sector-wide funding cut in 2016, the effects of which we still haven't fully seen. After concerted efforts in previous decades, the hegemony of white male privilege in the theatre is finally being challenged in this decade, though many, if not all, but two of the major companies and festivals around Australia still has a white male as its artistic director. Nevertheless, with sometimes faltering steps, Australian theatre has attempted to become more diverse and inclusive in this decade. The work of companies such as The Rabble and individual artists like Nicola Gunn and Nakia Louie is being presented at our international festivals and programmed in partnership with the major companies. With the establishment of new tertiary playwriting, directing and dramaturgical courses at VCA and NIDA, there has been a minor flourishing of new writing-driven companies such as MKA, Lonely Company and the New Working Group. And local council-run venues, particularly town halls, have begun to take the place of the mid-range venues to some extent. Spaces such as the Brunswick Mechanics Institute, Arts House at the North Melbourne Town Hall, the Meat Market and Northcote Town Hall are now focused on providing space for these new independent companies and artists, going some way towards re-establishing the network of mid-range venues destroyed in the 1990s. This decade has also seen an emergence of participatory and immersive performance, with companies focused on inviting their audiences to actively participate in the work, such as One Step at a Time Like This, Pop-Up Playground, Triage Live Art Collective, Field Theory and the Festival of Live Art. There are a lot of important exceptions that I haven't really covered in this video. Companies who have persisted over several decades, such as Melbourne Workers Theatre, Ranters, TheatreWorks, Red Stitch. But I would argue that these have been the exception rather than the rule, and I felt it was important to conclude with the description of how things most commonly are right now. This decade also saw a savage reduction of the Australia Council budget by the then Arts Minister, Senator George Brandis, who used the money sequestered from the AUSCO to attempt to establish a ministerial discretionary funding organisation to be known as the National Programme for Excellence in the Arts. These cuts were widely seen as a punitive measure on behalf of the government in retaliation for the arts and cultural sector's sustained criticism of government policy, particularly with regard to climate change, Indigenous recognition and mandatory detention of refugees. The long-term impact of these cuts and restructures will not be understood for years or even decades. This year, 2018, also saw the destruction of fire by the original Lamama building. They are committed to rebuilding and are in the process of raising the money. There's talk of government support, as well as talk of a massive redevelopment of the Victorian Arts Centre, but it's an election year and there are a lot of promises in the air. So, at the end of this really very brief and incomplete history of Australian theatre, we find ourselves, I believe, not so very far from where we started. In the 200 and something years since European theatre practice was brought to Australia, we have built a nationwide network of commercial live entertainment that was also a crucial part of the international touring circuit. We subsequently abandoned that network in favour of government-supported professional performance as a cultural enterprise. Throughout, there has been the ongoing presence of independent theatre makers, actors, playwrights, directors and designers who are driven to make new work for a live audience. Regardless of the industrial structures, their equity or efficiency, commercial or subsidised, what has been and is still consistent is the level of output by local artists. We have in the past few decades been told a story about ourselves as Australians that depicts us as suspicious of culture and conservative in taste. That theatre, and most other forms of cultural expression, isn't really an Australian thing. Hell, we didn't even really have our own theatre until the 1950s, and before that it was all international imports. This story is wrong. Australians have been making theatre since the first year they were deposited here by the English in 1788. And of course, for thousands of years before the arrival of this thing Europeans call theatre. I suspect the idea that Australians don't understand theatre serves to support a kind of cultural apathy masquerading as a mythic national identity. The strong, silent type, the Roo Webbers of this Australia, are all too easily dismissed by administrations beholden to managerial thinking, and so wealth continues to accumulate unchecked by culture and critique in the kinds of places wealth and power have already accumulated. What comes next is anybody's guess. Smarter people than me have made this particular prediction before and invariably have been wrong. I see a persistence of the actor-manager model, the small artist-driven collaborations that have been the backbone of Australian theatre since Barnett Levy dodgily opened the first Theatre Royal. The urge to get up in front of a crowd and say the thing you want to say isn't going to go away anytime soon. How that practice is conducted and, crucially, who gets to do it in the future is up to all of us to decide. There are many more options for how theatre is organised than those we are currently presented with. Government subsidy and competition with state-based flagship companies and festival culture is only one possibility, and perhaps it isn't the best one. The most successful and long-lasting projects in this current era, barring the state-funded flagship companies, have tended to be those that can recognise when they no longer serve a relevant need in the community and have reinvented themselves in response to their current environment. The making of culture is not a settled process. It evolves as the culture evolves, and so too must its processes and relationships. If it can't keep up with change, then ultimately it must atrophy and collapse. The same might be as well said for the industry as its companies. And at this stage in the government funding era, I will go so far as to say that I believe it's time that we started considering how our community will need to adapt once more. But what do you think? Are we on the verge of a great shift in the practice of the performing arts in Australia, or is it business as usual as far as the eye can see? What might any coming change look like, do you think? What should the theatre of Australia's future focus on? Leave your thoughts in the comments section, and we'll see you in 2019.